The morning Gideon Price discovered his warehouse empty, he understood that some thefts steal more than goods. They steal the man himself. Pine Hollow stretched before him like a graveyard of abandoned dreams, where even the wind seemed to mock his failure. The lonely merchant lost everything, until the widow with a noble past made him believe again. But belief, he would learn, requires first the courage to let someone witness your complete ruin. In the shadow of forgotten stagecoach routes, two broken souls would discover that sometimes the deepest losses prepare the heart for the most unexpected resurrections. The warehouse door hung open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream, and Gideon Price stood before it with the stillness of a man watching his own funeral. 3 days had passed since the Dalton gang had swept through Pine Hollow like a plague of locusts, leaving behind only the hollow echo of hoofbeats and the bitter taste of betrayal. His hands, once steady enough to count coins in the dark, now trembled as they traced the splintered wood where his life's work had been stored. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty floor, and each beam of light seemed to illuminate another memory of what had been taken from him. The smell of leather and tobacco still lingered in the air, ghosts of merchandise that would never return. Gideon had built his trading post from nothing, carrying goods across treacherous mountain passes, sleeping under stars that promised nothing but the chance to try again tomorrow. For 15 years, he had been the bridge between the isolated settlements and the wider world, bringing news, supplies, and hope to places the railroad had forgotten. Now the shelves stood bare as winter bones, and the silence pressed against his chest like a physical weight. Pine Hollow had always been a town that existed in the spaces between other places, perched on the edge of civilization like a bird on a wire. The main street stretched barely 300 yards, lined with buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support against the mountain winds. Most of the storefronts bore the weathered signs of businesses that had come and gone, their painted letters fading like the dreams of the men who had hung them. The old stagecoach routes that once brought life to the settlement now served only as reminders of a prosperity that had moved on to easier ground. Gideon walked through the empty warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the vast space like the heartbeat of a dying man. The bandits had taken everything, the bolts of fabric that Mrs. Henderson had ordered for her daughter's wedding dress, the medicine that Doc Morrison needed for the fever that had been spreading through the valley, the tools that would have helped the farmers prepare for spring planting. But more than the goods themselves, they had stolen his purpose, his identity, the very reason he rose each morning before dawn to check his inventory and plan his routes. The irony cut deeper than any physical wound. He had survived Apache raids, flash floods that had washed out bridges, and winters that had frozen men solid in their saddles. He had outrun claim jumpers and outlaws, had negotiated with hostile tribes and corrupt officials, had built a reputation for reliability that stretched from Denver to Santa Fe. Yet here he stood, defeated not by the elements or his own mistakes, but by the simple greed of men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light through the broken windows, Gideon felt the weight of his 46 years settling on his shoulders like a yoke. His hair had gone grey at the temples, his hands bore the scars of 1,000 small injuries, and his back ached from years of loading and unloading wagons. He had always told himself that age was just a number, that experience was worth more than youth, but standing in the ruins of his life's work, he felt every day of those years like stones in his pockets, dragging him down toward a darkness he had never imagined possible. Lucinda Harrow moved through Pine Hollow with the measured grace of a woman who had learned that survival often depended on being noticed just enough, but never too much. She wore her widow's black-like armor, the fabric speaking of respectability and loss in equal measure, while her eyes held secrets that the mountain winds had never been able to steal. The townspeople knew her as the Colonel's widow, the woman who had brought dignity to their rough settlement, but they had never seen the scars that her long sleeves concealed, or the way her hand sometimes moved instinctively to her hip where a gun had once rested. She found Gideon sitting on the steps of his empty warehouse, staring at the mountains as if they might offer him answers that the valley had refused to provide. His shoulders curved inward like a man trying to make himself smaller, to disappear into the weathered wood behind him, and something in that posture reminded her of her own darkest hours. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, and she could see the way defeat had settled into the lines around his eyes, the same way grief had once carved itself into her own face. The sound of her approach made him look up, and for a moment their eyes met with the recognition that passes between people who have both stared into the abyss and somehow found the strength to step back from its edge. She had known Gideon Price by reputation long before the robbery. The merchant who could be trusted, who kept his word even when it cost him profit, who had once ridden through a blizzard to deliver medicine to a dying child. Now she saw him stripped of everything that had defined him, reduced to the essential man beneath the merchant's facade. Pine Hollow's main street stretched between them like a stage where too many tragedies had been performed, and Lucinda felt the familiar weight of decision pressing against her chest. She had built her life in this town on careful calculation, on the precise balance between revelation and concealment that kept her safe from questions she could not answer. Her house stood at the end of the street like a fortress of respectability, its white picket fence and rose garden speaking of a life lived within proper boundaries. But the woman who tended those roses had once ridden with men who answered to no law but their own. The words came to her slowly, each one weighed and measured like gold dust in a prospector's pan. She had learned long ago that offers of help could be more dangerous than outright threats, that kindness could expose vulnerabilities that enemies had never been able to find. But something in Gideon's stillness, in the way he held his defeat like a man cradling a wounded bird, made her step forward despite every instinct that warned her to maintain her distance. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the careful modulation of a woman who had learned to hide her true nature behind layers of propriety and social convention. She offered him work, simple tasks around her property, repairs that needed a man's strength, errands that would give him purpose without requiring him to rebuild everything he had lost. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm, and she could see him weighing the offer against his pride, his desperation against his dignity. The silence that followed stretched like the shadow of a cloud crossing the valley, and in that moment Lucinda felt the familiar tension between the woman she had become and the person she had once been. She had spent years building a reputation for quiet charity, for the kind of Christian kindness that befitted a colonel's widow. But this offer came from a deeper place, from the part of her that remembered what it felt like to lose everything and find yourself standing alone in a world that had no use for your particular kind of broken. The morning came with frost painting the windows of the general store, and Gideon found himself standing behind the counter for the first time in months, his hands remembering the weight of commerce even as his heart struggled to believe in its purpose. Lucinda moved through the aisles like a ghost made flesh, her fingers trailing over bolts of fabric and jars of preserves with the careful attention of someone who understood that small things could anchor a person to the world when everything else had been swept away. She wore a dark blue dress that morning, simple and unadorned, but there was something in the way she carried herself that spoke of battles fought in drawing rooms, and victories won with nothing more than the tilt of her chin and the steady gaze of eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. The first customer was Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose tongue was sharper than her husband's razor and twice as likely to draw blood, and she looked at Gideon with the kind of suspicion reserved for men who had fallen from grace and might contaminate the decent folk with their failure. But Lucinda stepped forward with a smile that was all politeness and steel, asking after Mrs. Henderson's rheumatism, with the kind of genuine concern that made the older woman's defenses crumble like sugar in rain. Gideon watched this small miracle unfold, the way Lucinda transformed potential hostility into grudging acceptance, with nothing more than the careful application of grace and the subtle reminder that she was, after all, the Colonel's widow, and her endorsement carried weight in a town that measured worth by bloodlines and bank accounts. By midday, the store had seen more customers than it had in weeks, drawn not by any particular need for goods, but by curiosity about the arrangement between the fallen merchant and the respectable widow. And Gideon found himself moving through the familiar rhythms of trade with something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Lucinda worked beside him without fanfare, her presence both calming and unsettling, and he caught himself stealing glances at her profile when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way her jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned and how her eyes grew distant when the conversation turned to the war and the men who hadn't come home. There was a story there, written in the careful way she held herself and the practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. And Gideon found himself wanting to know the chapters she kept hidden behind her widow's weeds and respectable reputation. The afternoon brought young Tommy Brennan with news that the Cartwright gang had been spotted 2 valleys over, and the colour drained from more than one face as the implications settled over the store like a shroud. These were the same men who had taken everything from Gideon, who had left him broken and bleeding in the dust while they rode away with his life's work. And the familiar taste of fear and rage rose in his throat like bile. But Lucinda's hand found his arm, her touch light but steady, and when he looked into her eyes he saw not pity but understanding, the recognition of someone who knew what it meant to face the wolves that circled just beyond the firelight, waiting for weakness to show itself in the trembling of hands or the breaking of voice. When the last customer had gone and the store fell into the golden silence of late afternoon, Lucinda turned to him with an expression that was part question and part challenge, and Gideon realized that this moment had been building all day, that everything they had shared in careful glances and unspoken understanding was about to be tested by the simple act of honesty. She moved to the window and stood looking out at the empty street, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of confessions that had been too long delayed. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam, and Gideon learned that the Colonel's widow had secrets that would have scandalized the good people of Pine Hollow, that the woman who moved through their world with such careful propriety had once been someone else entirely. Someone who had loved unwisely and lost everything and rebuilt herself from the ashes of her own poor choices. The revelation hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, and Gideon understood that she had given him something precious and dangerous, a truth that could destroy the careful life she had constructed in the shadow of her husband's reputation. And the weight of that trust settled on his shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy to wear. The news of the Cartwright gang's proximity spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire through dry grass, and by evening the town had taken on the hushed, watchful quality of a place holding its breath. Gideon found himself unable to sleep, pacing the small room above the store while memories of his last encounter with those particular devils played behind his eyes like scenes from a nightmare he couldn't quite escape. The sound of their laughter still echoed in his ears, cruel and careless, the kind of mirth that came from men who had forgotten that their victims were human beings, with families and dreams and reasons to live. Lucinda had retired to her own quarters without another word about her confession, but her presence seemed to linger in the air like the scent of lavender and secrets. And Gideon found himself wondering what other truths lay buried beneath her careful composure. Morning brought Sheriff Dalton to their door, a man whose badge carried more weight than his years, and whose eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much of what men could do to each other when the veneer of civilization wore thin. He spoke in low tones about precautions and preparations, about the need for the townspeople to be ready for trouble, even as they hoped it would pass them by, like a storm that spent its fury on distant peaks. Gideon listened with half his attention, while the other half focused on Lucinda, who stood beside him with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. But he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders and the way her fingers worried at the fabric of her skirt when she thought no one was looking. The sheriff's visit had barely ended when the first of the refugees began to arrive, families from the outlying ranches who had packed what they could carry and fled before the approaching storm of violence and greed. They came in wagons loaded with children and chickens, and the precious few possessions that meant the difference between starting over and starting from nothing. Their faces drawn with the particular exhaustion that came from running toward an uncertain future, while looking over their shoulders at a past that burned behind them. Lucinda moved among them like an angel of mercy, offering what comfort she could and organizing the town's response with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of experience with crisis and catastrophe. By afternoon, Pine Hollow had transformed into something resembling a military camp, with men checking their weapons and women gathering supplies while children played games that mimicked the very real dangers their parents feared. Gideon found himself pressed into service, helping to fortify the more vulnerable buildings, his hands remembering skills he had learned during the war when survival had depended on the ability to turn any structure into a fortress. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that commerce never quite managed, and he caught himself thinking that perhaps there were other ways to rebuild a life than simply accumulating goods and counting profits. As evening approached, Lucinda appeared at his side with a rifle that looked as comfortable in her hands as a needle or a prayer book, and Gideon realized that the colonel's widow had depths he was only beginning to fathom. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained in the arts of war as well as the graces of society, and when she spoke of defensive positions and fields of fire, her voice carried the authority of someone who had stood on battlefields where the stakes were measured in lives rather than dollars. The revelation should have shocked him, but instead it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, explaining the steel beneath her silk and the way she faced the world with the calm confidence of someone who had already survived the worst that life could offer. The night settled over Pine Hollow like a blanket woven from tension and hope, and Gideon stood watch beside Lucinda on the store's roof, their shoulders almost touching as they scanned the horizon for signs of approaching trouble. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the understanding that came from shared purpose and mutual respect, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of promises made and kept. She told him about the colonel, about the man who had given her his name and his protection, but never quite his heart, and about the choices she had made in the shadow of a marriage that was more alliance than affection, and Gideon understood that her confession was both gift and burden, a trust that bound them together in ways that went deeper than business partnerships or convenient arrangements. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them, and Gideon felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the knots that had bound his heart since the day he lost everything. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps the future held possibilities he had been too broken to imagine. Dawn came pale and cold, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, while Pine Hollow held its collective breath and waited for whatever the day might bring. Gideon had dozed fitfully against the store's chimney, his rifle across his knees, and his dreams filled with the sound of approaching hoofbeats that might have been memory or prophecy. Lucinda sat beside him, her back straight and her eyes alert, and he marveled at her ability to maintain such perfect composure in the face of uncertainty, as if she had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she could not afford. The town below them stirred to reluctant life, smoke rising from chimneys and voices calling softly across the distance as people prepared for what might be their last ordinary morning. The Cartwright gang appeared on the eastern ridge just as the sun cleared the peaks, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky like harbingers of some ancient apocalypse. There were 8 of them, Gideon counted, their horses picking their way down the treacherous slope with the careful precision of predators who knew their business and took pride in their craft. At their head rode Jake Cartwright himself, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his talent for finding the weak spots in any defense, and Gideon felt his mouth go dry as memories of their last encounter flooded back with the force of a physical blow. But Lucinda's hand found his, her fingers cool and steady, and when he looked into her eyes he saw not fear, but the calm determination of someone who had chosen her ground and was prepared to hold it regardless of the cost. The gang's approach was leisurely, almost casual, as if they were merely travelers seeking supplies rather than wolves come to feast on the town's accumulated wealth and innocence. They rode down the main street with the arrogant confidence of men who had never met resistance they couldn't overcome, their eyes cataloguing potential threats and opportunities with the professional interest of craftsmen evaluating their workspace. Jake Cartwright himself dismounted in front of the general store, his spurs ringing against the wooden steps as he climbed toward the door, and Gideon felt his finger tighten on his rifle's trigger, even as Lucinda's grip on his hand reminded him that patience was sometimes the deadliest weapon of all. The confrontation, when it came, was not the explosive violence Gideon had expected, but something far more subtle and dangerous. A chess match played with words and glances, while the real game unfolded in the spaces between heartbeats. Cartwright entered the store with the casual arrogance of a man who owned whatever he could take, his eyes finding Gideon immediately, and lighting with the cruel pleasure of a cat who had cornered a particularly interesting mouse. But his attention shifted to Lucinda almost immediately, drawn by something in her bearing that spoke of quality and breeding. And Gideon watched with growing amazement as she transformed herself before his eyes into something that was part grande dame and part coiled serpent, her voice honey-sweet and her smile sharp enough to cut glass. The dance that followed was a masterpiece of misdirection and manipulation, with Lucinda playing the role of the helpless widow while simultaneously maneuvering Cartwright into a position where his own arrogance became his weakness. She spoke of her late husband's connections and her own family's influence with the kind of casual authority that made even hardened outlaws pause and recalculate their odds. And Gideon realized that he was watching a performance by someone who had learned her craft in drawing rooms, where reputations were destroyed with whispered words and fortunes lost over teacups. The other gang members grew restless as their leader became increasingly entangled in Lucinda's web of half-truths and veiled threats, and Gideon could see the moment when their confidence began to crack like ice under an unexpected thaw. The end, when it came, was swift and decisive, with Cartwright suddenly finding himself facing not a helpless town, but a coordinated defense that had been planned and prepared by someone who understood both strategy and psychology. The shots that rang out came from a dozen different directions, and the gang that had ridden into Pine Hollow with such confidence found themselves caught in a crossfire that left no room for escape or negotiation. Gideon's own rifle spoke twice, the reports echoing off the surrounding mountains like thunder, and when the smoke cleared, Jake Cartwright lay still in the dust, while his surviving men fled toward the horizon with their tails between their legs like whipped dogs. In the aftermath, as the town emerged from its hiding places and began to count the cost of their victory, Gideon found himself looking at Lucinda with new eyes, seeing not just the colonel's widow, or the woman who had offered him a second chance, but someone who had revealed herself to be his equal in ways he was only beginning to understand. And the knowledge settled in his chest like a warm coal that promised to kindle into something that might, with care and patience, become the fire that would light the rest of his life.